gone to the laptop from the iPad because
No, I
This
declined
works
doing
better
that,
for
but
me.
I
I can-
probably shouldn't have.
Yeah.
attach
like my
documents
old
and
one,
store
which is
documents
like-
that I can't do.
My old cover was like that. But you have one like I have,
It
right?
was a nice experiment, but I don't like it.
I try to.
Did they put it on incorrectly?
Okay, I know it's here because I've been looking at it
like this.
all day long.
And then it just opens up like a book.
And then you just kind of flip it over? What do you have on this side?
Nothing.
Let's see, I got something.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight is our special Finance Committee meeting on December 18th, 2017. Would the director please call the roll?
Certainly, Mayor Lansing,
Here?
Chairman Morris,
Here?
Alderman Beidler,
Here.
Alderman Rummel,
Here,
Alderman Newman,
Here.
Alderman Reisenberg,
Here.
Alderman Tack,
Here.
Alderman Moreno,
Here.
Alderman Bushman.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Before we start, I'd like to ask the mayor to make a few comments.
Thank you, Alderman Morris. Before Alderman Morris leads the Finance Committee tonight in discussing recommendations on contingency accounting procedures and the 2018 update to the core and elective services analysis, I wish to say various questions have arisen regarding lobbyist expenses incurred to secure an Amtrak stop in Lake Forest and to secure funding from various federal agencies for a pedestrian underpass at the West Lake Forest Station. City Council members have asked to enter into executive session for fact-finding purposes on personnel matters related to these lobbyist expenses. Thus, at the conclusion of the business agenda of the City Council tonight, the Council will enter into executive session, at which no formal actions will be taken tonight. And when fact-finding is completed, the findings and any related recommendations will be brought back to City Council for discussion, any appropriate decisions, and ample public questions and comments. This could occur at the January 16th City Council meeting. As a long evening tonight is anticipated, the Finance Committee and City Council agendas will be accomplished in an expeditious manner and will include for this purpose tonight shortening the public comment sections of the Finance Committee and the City Council agendas to 4 speakers of 3 minutes each. We realize others will want to speak and ask questions or make statements, and they are invited to do so at any time by email or letter. Alderman Morris.
Thank you. We have the minutes from the November 13th, 2017 meeting to approve. Do I have a motion?
so moved.
Second.
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, nay. I think the motion passes. The first item, as the mayor said, is item 3, which pertains to contingency accounting procedures and recommendations that the Director of Finance and I had developed. It relates to what came to light regarding the city's use of the Washington-based firm of Chambers, Colon, and Hartwell. This was in relation to obtaining or trying to obtain a grant funding for the proposed West Station underpass. I'd first like to say a sincere thank you, really, to the Lake Forest citizens who brought this to our attention. As you know, we were not aware of it, but I think I speak for the council when I say we very much appreciate the efforts that you did on this issue and bring it to our attention. So, thank you. Mayor Lansing has asked to do this review of the CACH expenditures, and so we'll have this executive session later tonight to begin work on that. But in addition, Director Holub and I last week started discussing what could we do to improve our policies and procedures regarding the use of professional services such as CCH. The director and I were trying to find some immediate short-term improvements that would give us better oversight and visibility over such expenses, especially when they are charged through our general fund contingency accounts, of which we have 2. And in the course of that discussion, we identified 4 short-term improvements going to ask the director to review for us and outline these proposed changes to our contingency accounts, which is where these expenses ended up. So, Director, could you comment on that?
Thank you, Chairman Morris. First, for the record, I do want to say that the city has very good internal controls and very good accounting policies and procedures. I would be happy to put them up against any community of similar size and scope. However, I recognize that there's always opportunity for improvement and happy to have an ongoing discussion with the council in that regard. As Chairman Morris noted, we did have a meeting on December 8th to specifically address the concerns that the council had at the December 4th meeting. Specifically, we talked about the contingency funds administration. The city has long had a practice of having two contingency accounts in the general fund, one in the city council budget, one in the non-departmental budget. Those are budgeted funds available to meet unexpected expenses during the year that come up and weren't anticipated when the budget was developed. There is a administration policy on how those funds are used, as well as a form to be completed by the requesting department. Copies of both of those were included in your packet. There is also a monthly contingency report prepared by the finance department that details in each of the two accounts encumbrances and expenses from that account. And that monthly contingency report is prepared by the finance department and submitted to the city manager's office. So the first recommendation coming out of the meeting on December 8th is to expand the distribution of that monthly contingency report to include the finance chairman, so that the City Council Finance Committee chairman and the city manager would receive that monthly report. Next, we also discussed the fact that the contingency request form from the operating departments is not always coming before the expense is incurred, although that is required by both the policy and the form. So the second recommendation that came out of that meeting is to re-educate operating departments on the administration of the contingency account, and to stress the necessity that that form is submitted prior to the expense being incurred, so that we can ensure that those funds are encumbered and there are indeed contingency amounts available when the invoice needs to be paid. The third recommendation relates to third-party payments, so payments that may be made to one particular payee, but then is paid out to another vendor. So we noted that there are obvious and recurring items that occur, such as when the city engages in a public works contract. The city may make all payments to the general contractor, but they are paying subcontractors as part of that project. So the recommendation number 3 is to adopt a policy whereby any third-party payments made through an intermediary receive city council acknowledgement and/or approval. And lastly, related to the fiscal year 2018 audit, just for benefit of the public, the city's finances are audited by an independent auditing firm every year. They typically send a staff of 3 or 4 auditors, and they spend about 4 weeks on site reviewing all accounting procedures and forms and verifying the accuracy of the financial information being reported. The audit committee that is appointed by the mayor and council receives that report from the independent auditing firm, and then the chair of the audit committee presents that audit in November to the city council. The audit committee is also tasked with considering and reviewing any recommendations that the auditors may make to improvements of the city's accounting processes. So the fourth recommendation is to include a specific recommendation and direction by the audit committee that is part of the FY 2018 audit. The auditors would review the contingency account specifically and provide a report on any recommendations that they would offer to improvements of that contingency account administration. So those are the 4 immediate recommendations coming out of the meeting. We would just look for the Finance Committee's comments on that. If you are in agreement with those recommendations, we would move towards putting those in place. Any that affect the purchasing policies would come back to the Finance Committee for review before they are implemented effective May 1st.
Very good. Questions? Alderman Marino?
Thank you, Chairman Morris. Two additions that I'd like for us to consider. One, that in absolute dollar amount on an annual basis, the limit per payee or subcontractor be set at a number. 25,000 pops into mind. I know that we have needs from time to time and that we need to be able to address them, but I would think that 25,000 on an annual basis per payee, per subcontractor payee would be adequate. And secondly, I would limit at a maximum no more than 50,000 per annum per any payee or subcontractor. So 25,000 per limit, per absolute dollar payment, and 50,000 on an annual basis before it must come to city council.
And does that include the public works subcontractors as well?
Well, those probably are not in the contingency.
No, are you talking about just the contingency fund?
This is just the contingency. We
Okay.
have, I believe, other rules already
Right,
set
right.
and limits set for normal
Okay.
course.
Very good. I'll take that.
Does that, I mean, those are very good and very typical restrictions, but elsewhere in policy, we have provisions for emergency expenditures on, in certain circumstances, disasters and so forth. I think in whatever we craft there, it ought to somehow match up with that. I may be
I
mischaracterizing.
defer to the director.
Yeah.
I don't remember a specific thing about emergencies, but maybe,
Well, I'm just worried if we had a stated amount and something was going on.
Right,
that's all.
just for clarification, the city does adopt an annual budget, although legally, the city is an appropriation ordinance city. So by the end of the first quarter of each fiscal year, the city must approve an appropriation ordinance. In that appropriation ordinance, we add 10% to each fund's budget, and that's for significant issues that may arise during the year. That may be the difference, the confusion. But we administer the budget amount throughout the year.
Right.
So while that 10% is added in the appropriation ordinance for legal purposes, that would have to come to the city council for approval because we are still administering the budget amount that was approved. That's helpful.
Perhaps for clarity, my thinking here was that the chairman of the finance committee would have oversight for this contingent limitation, and that'd
sure.
be part of the chairman's
Yes.
duties. But certainly in the event that there is an emergency or disaster of some nature, I would certainly
no,
expect
but I
that we'd
think
function.
Elizabeth has hit the nail on the head. We have a procedure for that in terms of the extra funds in each of the accounts. It's in the contingency account where it's not as dedicated to a specific purpose. So, other questions?
Yes,
Alderman
thank you.
Bynum.
I'd like to make a comment first. Thank you. You teed this up as something that was going to happen at our meeting here 2 weeks ago. And it sounds like only a couple of days passed and you sat down to crank this out, and I'm incredibly appreciative. I do have a couple of questions and a couple of suggestions. My one question is, which of the contingency funds did the lobbying expenditure come out of?
I've got it here. It was in
Non-departmental.
the general fund, non-departmental fund.
Okay, and I guess, I'm not sure this is the place for it, we could do it another time, exactly clear on how those are divided. One's called a city council fund, and one's the, and do you want to just talk briefly about how?
Sure, there are two,
how they're
but I'll
different?
let,
Or Elizabeth, how those are different from each other?
And how she segregates.
Over the time I have been here, the way we have administered that is that if an item expensed from either of those accounts was initiated by the city council or related to a city council initiative, then it comes out of the city council contingency account. Whereas if it's just something that has arisen out of the natural course of the departmental operations, then it comes out of non-departmental.
Okay, thank you. So a couple of other things. I will honestly say, Director Holub noted that accounting procedures may not always be followed, caught my attention. And it sounds like we're trying to tighten that up. I assume that that's probably true, like at my house. But in any place. On the other hand, as someone who sits on the city council with fiduciary responsibility, I see a sentence like that, and it absolutely gives me pause. So I may feel the need to follow up now a little more often in terms of questioning, and because I have some concerns. I would like to address for a moment the contingency account administration procedures, if I may.
Sure.
So this document was effective May 1st, 2013, revised March 1st, 2015. I don't know if it's something we should look at more often. It seems like if we're having the audit of the document, maybe. I am noticing that on this, instead of in the second section, the requisition entry and so on, people's names are noted but not functions. It strikes me that a really fully usable document lists the functions of the person involved in various activities, not the names. And so, for example, a form we're using that we modified in 2015, not all those people are even still here. So I would prefer a document that I would simultaneously prefer a document that was reviewed annually, but I would also prefer a document that used the people's functions rather than their names. And I think
Sure, that's a good point.
I think that's my comments for now.
Thank you. Those are good.
If
Alderman Marino?
if I may, in one instance, there's a person who's no longer.
That's what I was saying.
That's
Yeah.
precisely.
So when you have a document that refers to a person doing a job, but that person isn't here, it does beg the question, who is now
Exactly.
doing that job, or is that job not being done?
Sure.
So you obviate that by just getting to the function. So that was I observed that person is no longer here, at least one of them.
And we, as a follow-up, and after the first year, we're going to go back at that issue of compliance. So you'll see more discussion on that. Further questions? If not, thank you, Doctor. Appreciate it. The next item on the agenda relates to the part of the budget that we are beginning to work on. And I'm going to ask Mike Strong, Assistant to the City Manager, for an update on the core and selective service analysis. As you may know, we did a strategic plan, and this is now a bridge from that plan over to the budgeting that we'll be doing in the spring. So these begin to define where the money is most likely to be spent. So, Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Honorable Mayor, members of the Finance Committee. Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce this iteration of the core and elective service. As the Chairman mentioned, staff does go through this exercise each year. It is a part of the annual budget process. We review all of the programs and services we provide and evaluate them based on their assessment or classification. And tonight, I want to just provide you with an overview of our process that we've undergone for 2018, discuss the inclusion of a new methodology that we have included, and allow some time just to review sort of our timeline and next steps for this. And not looking for any specific action this evening, but just want to kind of give you an update. So as mentioned, we've been going through this exercise since roughly 2009. This is an inventory just broken down by department, approximately 100 and some services. 80% of those roughly have been evaluated as core, which means departments have felt that those either contribute to or ensure the health, safety, welfare of the community, as opposed to elective, which may be viewed as more enhancing quality of life, but maybe not necessarily mandated or required to provide them. I've included in your packets a list of those services and then the specific details regarding a description of those. What we tried to look at this year was a new methodology. Similar to the capital program that we review each year, staff completes a score sheet that has a series of questions, and it helps sort of assess and rate an infrastructure project based on a prioritization or a need basis. To help include some data in this process, we thought maybe there are some questions we could ask, and as the chairman mentioned, the strategic plan being one of them. But what are some of the basic attributes when we look at evaluating our services? What are some important questions we could ask as a community, as staff, ask ourselves? And these were some of the the core attributes that we sought to really evaluate as we looked at this. As you may have noticed, each staff in each department sort of went through this list and maybe answered these questions somewhat differently, but I think for the purposes of 2018, I think it served as a nice approach to this process and kind of helped, I think, elicit hopefully some good conversation that maybe you had with your departments, that staff maybe had internally about, why we provide certain programs. Are we required to do it? How reliant are our stakeholders on the city to provide them? Those types of questions. Do they align with our strategic goals, which is important? So we created a score sheet, which was utilized and evaluated, and certainly, hopefully, an iteration of this is something we can use moving forward and continue to kind of look at in terms of how we classify these programs. So tonight, really just wanted to brief you, introduce you, provide you some proposed changes that staff has prepared this evening. What we'll be doing next is making that document less the scores, because at this point, I think we still have some validity questions that we want to work out, but make that available to the public to review, similar to what we do with other plans. And then at the next Finance Committee meeting on January 16th, we would consider those changes, any feedback, and consider approving those as part of the budget process for next year. So at this point, I'd be happy to answer any questions. You maybe have observations of the process this year, takeaways, and any other feedback you may have.
My question was, I think that there was mention of putting this on the website. Is that going to go forward?
Yeah, we can certainly do that. And what, we typically make this a part of the Finance Committee packet, but, just to have a process in place to allow for some comment might be beneficial.
Yeah, but how would people know that it's on there for them to look at?
So we, in the past, in 2009-10, we've made a link available and have asked for feedback, or questions regarding core and elective services. It's in the budget document, but to have a link on the website that maybe asks for feedback, allowing them a way to submit that would be how we'd capture it. And I think this year, trying to because of timing and all that, allowing for a greater period of time than would be available with just the packet on the 16th, but to allow for something here towards the end of this year and early next year.
And just as how do I know as a member of the public that I am invited to comment on this unless it comes to my attention or there's maybe a block on the city's website or something that calls it to my attention that I'm being invited to comment on these core and elective services?
Correct. So news items on the homepage, having a link, having the document available to download, to look at, and then to have an email address or a way to submit feedback would be a way we manage that or offer that opportunity.
Yeah, a lot of residents don't on a regular basis check the website, but if we had something going out to them, and it goes back to communication again, that would alert them to the fact that we are inviting their comment, and I just don't know how we do that, because, frankly, before I was elected to this council, I was not checking the city's website on a regular basis. So I think we need to think about how we invite public comment on some of these things. I think it's a great idea, but it's not going anywhere if nobody knows about it. And so that's one concern that I had looking at this. And then the second question that I have is, some of these programs that I looked at, particularly like in elective, they were grouped together in, sometimes there are 6 or 7 programs grouped together. Who grouped them? Was that done by the department head?
Correct. Yeah, staff within the departments, and depending on how they've categorized those programs. So one of them had been grouped before, and now if you look at some have been actually expanded to separate.
Right, and they
become more
changed.
granular. Sure. So I think that's a part of the review each year that staff undergoes internally, and then that they review with the liaison. So that's.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't
Yeah.
second guess the staff on that, but it did strike me that, maybe one of these 7 elective services would be something that I might consider core. And so the grouping struck me as sort of, there's a presumption in there that grouping them all together, maybe there's a core in there, but it's one of the 7 that are deemed elective. So I don't know how you address that, and again, it's staff, but I just would call that out to be cautious about some of those things, and call it out, to residents who may be watching, that, I think you need to look at this, and maybe something in those groups could be deemed elective and core instead of elective, or vice versa.
Okay. Mayor?
My observation on all this, I guess, back through the years is, what was it? About 15 years ago, the city had 253 full-time employees, and today we're at 102, or a week or 10 days ago, we were at 102, which is an outgrowth of, quite frankly, a noticeable culture and mentality of constant improvement and scrubbing. So to sort of make that real, because I'm the liaison to public safety, for example, and the offices of the city manager, I sat down with the city manager, and he's got 7 core and 7 elective. Well, almost all 7 of those elective ones are what I would call core communications requirements. It's an obligation to report. And, it's one of them is how much we invest in the website and how much we invest in printed materials and all that sort of thing. But while there's a spirit of constant improvement, there's also the reality if there's a tax freeze, and, and all kinds of things happen in our state government that, we may have to cut, $1 million, $2 million, $4 million, $5 million. And so just where would you do it? And so in my personal observation, most of these elective services, again, in the context of going from 252 to 201 in 15 years, so how many governmental entities in America have done that, is these elective services are they're either at or on top of the bone, or right near the bone. So, for example, I sat down with a police chief, and my gosh, there were 2 elective services. And so I said, well, wait a minute, how can anything in the police department be elective? Well, he said one is school crossing guards. I mean, if you have to cut money, you got to cut it somewhere. And the other one was sort of equally at the bone, cutting the bone. So I think these are very tightly done. I think the scoring system, while it doesn't fit evenly across every department, is actually surfaces up a lot of examination. And it's as thorough a thing as I've seen in industry, actually, in terms of, what we do and how our processes work and what's important. So, and it takes a lot of time. I think part of the communication is one really has to opt into this, because there's a lot of material to review and understand all this.
Very good. Alderman Moreno?
Maybe it's actually a follow-on to prior comments. I think it would be really helpful to have an understanding of the trends in core and elective by department over time, because for any city councilman who's sitting here, we look at this once a year, and I don't always look back to last year or the year before that or the year before that. So I think it's very instructive to see what the trends are by department in core and elective, and along with that is the ability for each of us, residents and all of us, to self-serve government so that we can kind of do what needs to be done and ensure that it happens to the best of our ability. Obviously, always along with departmental help, but I like to think that we can use technology to be more efficient in our use of government. So I don't know if that's a trend that you can actually quantify as yet, but at least in core and elective, it would be helpful to see a time series on it.
Yeah, it's something we can certainly look at putting together.
Put that out. Very good. Questions? All right. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate it. The last item before the comments is the flash report. Are there any questions on the flash report? We don't have to vote on it, but it was circulated so everyone can see where we are at this point in the year. Any questions for Elizabeth? If not, thank you. We'll move on to the sixth item, which is the opportunity for the public to address the Finance Committee. And the mayor has a procedure he wants to implement with the, I think you had.
Oh, here, I just
Yeah,
picked
go ahead and-
4 out of here. I'm not sure I can read this. Kate Zimlier, 351 East Wisconsin.
And you have to, our time limit is 3 minutes per person. Keep things moving along, but there'll be a bell that goes off.
Okay.
Thank you.
Some of my comments you've already addressed. Like you said, my name's Kate Simlick. I'm in the first ward,
Right, good.
351 East Wisconsin Avenue. Wanted to just discuss what was mentioned in the December 16th Tribune article, just to kind of preface where I'm going. It quotes our city manager saying, "It should not have happened. It won't happen again going forward." He's held this manager position for 27 years. He said he had proved the payments. He had said that he had the authority to spend as much as $20,000 without council approval. He approved the payments to the chambers as the lobbying efforts continued. He said that he should have brought the matter to the city council in May of 2016, 2 months after the city began paying chambers and when it was considered additional payments. That was my error. I did nothing. I did not bring it to the council as it should have been brought, he said. And at that point, it was part of our regular payments, and I quite frankly didn't even think of it. That's a direct quote from that article. I believe the spirit of granting the city manager the authority to spend that $20,000 without council approval is to not limit him doing his job and not to tie his hands and delay and cause excess time to happen to do his job. Our city manager states that he should have requested the approval in May. I think that's a really important distinction. I read that to say that's when the third payment would have happened and he would have crossed that $20,000 threshold. The major flaw in that logic, in my opinion, is that it was a part of a global strategy. It wasn't a one-time payment. It wasn't $9,500. It was a global strategy. And I think that's a really important distinction. We all know that when anyone enters into a proposal, whether it's me in business or you in your home repair, you set out a scope. You talk about scope and you talk about a total payment. So while no payment exceeded his $20,000, the total did. And the spirit of what was being done did. I would request that the Finance Committee change the authority to state that the $20,000 limit of the city manager is limited to one-time payment. And I think that some of what you already talked about is addressing that. I think if any payment group has one spirit, so one goal, I think that the city council needs to limit it. I don't know any of you. I don't know the city manager. I'm sure he does a great job. He has 27 years of experience, as do I. This is not the mistake of a novice. I'm not going to go towards intent, although if you read that article, it talks about his intentions were pure. I don't think it matters who intended what, but there are rules for a reason. Those rules are there to protect the community and financial responsibility, and I think you need to understand that people are upset about this. Trust takes years to build, seconds to break, and forever to repair.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Sam Halleck, 698 South Waukegan Road.
How you doing, folks? I just want to speak about the track, the third track. I moved into the city of Lake Forest a few years back, and I loved it. I said to myself, I wouldn't want to live anyplace else. But lately, I mean, I feel like a second-class citizen living on the west side. Forgive me for saying that. I don't mean to be disrespectful for you guys. I know 3 of the aldermen here voted against that car wash thing, and 500 people voted or signed a petition against it. And nevertheless, he tried to shove that down our throat, even though there's a safety factor and quality of life is being sacrificed. Now, the same thing with the railroad track now. I lived one house away from the railroad track on Waukegan Road. And believe me, in the middle of the night, when that freight train goes by, my house shakes like a leaf. And I can imagine with the 3rd track there, what our quality of life is going to be like. It's going to be miserable. So I want you to take that into account, kindly please. And again, I don't hear of an extra track on the east side of the city. I don't hear a car wash on the east side of the city. It seems like we're the dumping ground. It's not fair. That's all I got to say. Please, I do appreciate the 3 aldermen that were helpful with the car wash situation, where they voted against it. But nevertheless, nobody on the west side wants that car wash, and it lowers our property value and everything else. But nevertheless, they were trying to shove that thing down our throat. Thank you.
Thank you. Joanne Desmond, 1681 Yale Court.
Thank you for calling on me. My mom's in ICU at Highland Park Hospital. I needed to get here and I have to get back, so I can't say these comments later. But first of all, I appreciate your conversation and your discussion here. I think you probably know that many of us are lacking a trust in our city government based on evidence of concealment of public funds and contracts, duplicity in the communication of untrue and misleading statements, which we can prove, and hypocrisy in making statements to residents that there is no money to oppose the third rail, along with claims that the city has no power because the railroads are outside its jurisdiction, while surreptitiously spending exorbitant amounts of taxpayer dollars to exert that very same influence on the railroad to get an Amtrak stop. It's even more reprehensible that our mayor and some of our city council defend this unethical conduct, but we are very grateful for the city council members who have questioned this proven lack of transparency and are asking questions to hold people accountable. The taxpayers of Lake Forest believe there's much more that is hidden, and we want to know exactly how much of our taxpayer money was spent to get the Amtrak stop. Since our city has refused to comply with our numerous FOIA requests, we're asking the city council to respond to the following, and I'll pass these out to you later. Number 1, we want to see the contracts of everyone that had anything to do with the city regarding the Amtrak stop, including lobbyists, engineers, consultants, lawyers, etc., starting with 2012 with the Quandel consultant report. We want to see those contracts. We want to see the minutes of the city council meeting where these contracts were discussed and approved. We want to see the itemized invoices from the Filippini law firm that funneled the payments to your lobbyist and identifies the exact legal cost to the taxpayers that was paid to your law firm to hide these expenditures. We want to know the role of the Metro Board Chairman, Norm Carlson, in advising the city manager to use this lobbying firm. We want to know if our tax dollars have been used to support Metro's lobbying efforts for the third siding rail for freight trains. We want to know if there were secret negotiations between the city and Metro where the city agreed to support or not to oppose the dangerous third siding rail for freight trains in exchange for Metro allowing Amtrak to stop in Lake Forest. We want to know if it was necessary for the city to hire a lobbyist to get an Amtrak stop when it had already been granted consent by WSDOT and IDOT. We're waiting written confirmation from the CEO of Amtrak on that issue. We want to know how the city manager and mayor can claim that the Amtrak stop and the third rail to hold freight trains are separate issues if we follow the money. We want to know how the mayor and some aldermen can say there's no money to fight the third rail when the city secretly spent hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars to secure an Amtrak stop with questionable benefit to our community. These are just a few of the many questions that the taxpayers have about the business operations of our city, and we do hope that those of you who are interested in honesty and integrity in our city government will help us find the answers to those questions. And we thank those of you who really care and show that you're caring by the conversations that you're having this evening. Thank you.
Can I ask a
Thank you.
question of staff?
One more?
Who do I ask?
I'm sorry.
Let's see, Rick Cusack, 1126 Pine Oaks.
I think I'll pass.
Okay. Tom Sarsfield.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and members of the council. At the last meeting, I mentioned that we would do well to concentrate on addressing the environmental risk associated with the Hiawatha project. Toward that end, what I did was I went back and dug out a letter from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency that was written to the major parties involved, the Federal Railroad Administration, WSDOT, IDOT, Amtrak, and so on. And what they did in this letter was to basically lay down some guidelines that they suggested that the NEPA process, meaning the National Environmental Policy Act, be followed in this environmental assessment. And they mentioned some areas, which I'll go through kind of hurriedly here. I know we've got a time problem. But they described different aspects that they felt should be addressed. They described how the proposed project should look at the impact of freight operations, how it should depict how the project would interact with the surrounding area, and should clarify the present and future train equipment which would be involved, which would help assess the noise and air quality assessments. This NEPA document, which they suggested be followed as a guideline, should, quote, fully disclose and consider ways to minimize and mitigate temporary and long-term emissions and potential health impacts. And they mentioned things like freight train idling and specifically, and I was very interested in this one, they mentioned Executive Order 13045, and it addressed proximity to places where children live, learn, and play. And I thought that was very interesting that they emphasized that. They also said that the NEPA document should quantify impacts to wetlands in conjunction with the Army Corps of Engineers. And of course, that would address our beloved Middle Fork Savannah. Also, things like idling times of trains, mitigation of noise impact, public safety issues like preparedness plans, contingency plans, spill response plans. It had a lot in there. And my purpose in going back and resurrecting this information from the Environmental Protection Agency is really to point out that there's a lot of heavy stuff here, and it's stuff which calls for expertise in addressing some of these key issues to make sure we get our day in court. And I think toward that end, I would highly encourage the council to think about retaining an attorney who has a working knowledge of environmental issues, who can monitor this process and help us challenge any shortcomings in the process as they take place, not waiting until it's a fait accompli. I'm not sure how much we can influence this process, but I certainly think we should try and find out, rather than wait until sometime in the spring when we throw our hands up and say, well, if that's what you think, okay, that's the way it is. I think we should be addressing this as we go along. And I think having a knowledgeable attorney in the environmental area would go a long way toward doing that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Before we adjourn, are there questions from the council that?
Yeah, I'd have a question for staff. I've heard from Ms. Desmond now, this isn't the first time, this is the second time, that there are FOIA requests that haven't been fulfilled, and that concerns me. Can you shed some light, can anyone shed some light on this?
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. When we get FOIA requests, we process them, follow the Open Meetings Act. They go to they're distributed to various departments. Those responses are then emailed back to the requester. We actually have a log of all the FOIAs that the city gets and the responsive records that go with those FOIAs.
And so are there FOIA requests that have not been addressed or responded to in that process?
We actually respond to all the FOIA requests that we get, whether they might be denied. Parts of them may be denied, parts of them might be fulfilled. But every FOIA request that comes in gets a response.
If I can go further, what would be the circumstance where part or all of that would be denied?
For instance, let's take a police report as an example. The victim's identification, the witness's identification, personal information. There's a lot of things that could be. There's a lot of exceptions that the city can use to withhold the information. We actually try to give out as much information as we possibly can on all the FOIAs that come in.
Well, then outside of the context of this meeting, I wonder if it would be possible for you to meet with Ms. Desmond as to what specifically she's referring to.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to.
And have Dave Tanaka, who's the one who does FOIA, and he's had numerous requests, and we've sent us track letters that we've sent to you, that the response that we've gotten. And the responses that we have gotten from WISDA and IDOT were a lot of information that you haven't sent to us at all, that we were able to get from them.
But if we can address this outside of this meeting, but I just wanted to
I'd be happy
address
to.
it.
Your number and your name, and we'll have Dave Tanaka reach you.
Certainly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That being all of the business for the Finance Committee, I'd accept a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Second? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Nay? Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
All right, we'll take a 5-minute recess and then start the council meeting.
No, today, did she say, I don't think these are the same questions. Did she say she was going to give us copies of questions?
Yeah, I'd like the copies of the questions too.